All right. Hello, everybody. I'm seeing that we have some people from all over the world. We got some folks from India. I'm Brian Fobi. I am the CEO, founder of Gurufi.com. I'm out on the West Coast, so while some of you guys might be in the evening, I'm in the early morning hours. But luckily, I have a little bit of coffee to power me through this morning. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, which is that I'm going to talk to you today about using storytelling in your admissions essays. Now, the reason that I chose this particular approach is that I deal with a lot of clients, obviously, every year. And one of the things that I notice when I'll get an initial draft of a personal statement or some bit of admissions writing, and then when I'll actually sit down and talk to them, is like people often have these really interesting and amazing stories that they didn't convey in the written materials. And it's my job to sort of get them to figure out how to tell that story on paper in a way that's really compelling. Now, the big challenge with this is that, when you think about storytelling and writing, these are disciplines that can take years and years and years to learn. But, while I'm not going to, in the course of the next 45 minutes, get you a PhD in English literature or anything like that, I do think there are some things that I can convey to you today that will help you make your admissions writing a little bit more powerful. Next. All right. So like I say here, everyone has a story. One of the things that I consistently encounter with clients and I'll talking to them is they'll feel like their life isn't interesting. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But I think that if you actually sit down and think about the things that you want to do, the place that you are in your life right now, and the place that you've come from, you can mine those experiences and those ideas in order to create a story that's compelling and unique to you and that conveys exactly the thing that you want to do in your MBA, your business school, and your professional journey. Next. All right. So again, who am I? I'm Brian Fobi. Like I said, I have a JD and a PhD. I've been teaching for just over 2 decades. I teach writing at Harvard University. Won a bunch of awards there for that. I founded Gurufi in 2005, and in that time, we've helped more than 6,000 clients get admission into top schools. In the last year alone, we had a really great admission cycle last year. Harvard Business School, Wharton, INSEAD, Oxford, Stern, Anderson, on and on and on. So our clients have had a lot of success. And I think the evidence is borne this out, is that a lot of our success comes from the fact that we really focus on helping clients to tell their own personal story. We don't have like a cookie cutter method, fill in the blanks type of thing. It's focused on figuring out what your story is and how to tell it. Next. All right. So I'm going to be talking about some storytelling elements and some techniques and tips for writing a compelling story. If you want to follow up on these ideas, I'd urge you to go to blog.gurufi.com. There's a free worksheet that you can download there that has some exercises and some step-by-step progressions that you can take to go from maybe not having a clear idea about what you want your personal statement to be about to having a really solid outline that you can use to build out your personal statement. So it's a little PDF. You can go blog.gurufi.com. The top entry there is for today's folks here at this GMAT event. Next. All right. So let me begin with the most obvious statement. It is not going to necessarily make me sound like a genius, but I think everyone understands that this is true. Writing a personal statement is hard. I have obviously had to do this several times, given my own educational journey. You do it before you're applying to a school. And even if you are a really seasoned, effective, strong writer, there's some things about writing a personal statement that make it uniquely difficult. And so, I have helped people who have, literally last year, there was a woman who already had a PhD in English literature from Stanford University. And I was wondering, like, why in the world is she coming to us for help with her writing? And again, it was, this is a very unique and different style of writing. So even if you are comfortable with writing generally, a lot of you have a lot of experience with business writing, for instance. It's a different style and approach that you're going to need for writing a personal statement. Next. All right. So here's a couple of points about why writing a personal statement is hard, right? The first thing I often say to people is that healthy people don't brag about themselves, right? If you meet someone out in the world, at a party, at a bar, on the bus, at work, and this is the type of person who's constantly bragging, telling you all the great things that they've done, that's not the type of person typically that you want to be around. The hard thing about a personal statement is that this is you advocating for yourself. And so you do have to find ways not to boast about yourself, but to say really positive things about yourself. And for a lot of people, that's hard. Second point here, it's hard to know what's interesting about yourself. I tell this story about a doctor years ago who came to us, and they were a practicing physician, and they basically wanted to get an MBA because they wanted to get into the management side of the hospital. And they had a perfectly fine personal statement. I'd worked with them for an hour, gone through all the questionnaires and everything. And I asked them near the end of our session together, it's like, look, I noticed that there's this 18-month gap in your CV. What happened there? And he's like, well, my country fell into a civil war, and when I was in the middle of medical school, and so I opened a clinic where we helped both rebels and government soldiers suffering from bullet wounds and shrapnel wounds. I was only in my first year of medical school, so I had to go on YouTube and figure out how to treat these various kinds of injuries. And I was like, whoa, like everything that you've told me up to this point is far less interesting than that. Like he was convinced it wasn't an interesting story to tell. And that's because for so many of us, our lives are just the things that we go through every day. There's nothing interesting or compelling about them. And so sometimes it takes another person to be able to actually go through and ask you some questions and, to figure out what it is that's interesting and compelling about what they do and who they are. And finally, this is maybe the most obvious of the three, is that there's this immense amount of pressure that you feel about getting every little bit of your admissions writing correct, right? And because you've not done this before, maybe, or the last time you did it was when you were applying to your undergraduate school, this pressure is not a lot of times very good in terms of producing effective writing. And so people just feel stuck and they don't know where to begin, and they read about other applicants who seem so amazing and so much better than them. They feel overwhelmed by that. And so you've got to find ways to create a process where you step back from it and just allow yourself the space to write and to pursue your ideas. Next. All right, so here are what I call my three most common pieces of usually bad advice. I'm going to tell you what they are and then sort of give a caveat for each one. Next. So first, people a lot of times talk about what's your brand. The reason that this is tricky or difficult is that unless you actually come from a marketing background and you understand how to create branding and what branding is, what's your brand a lot of times can come across as this very superficial thing that, like athletes and celebrities and Instagram models will talk about, like, oh, I have a personal brand. And there isn't necessarily a lot of thought that people put into what exactly that means. If you understand branding, and if this is something that resonates with you, then yeah, use this approach. But I've found that when, people say like, oh, what's my brand and how do I put that into my personal statement, that it moves them away from actually telling a compelling story within their personal statement. Next. Be yourself, right? This is the piece of advice that everyone's mom gives them before they go out on a first date. Here's the hard thing about the be yourself bit of advice. You don't have to be a schizophrenic to have lots of different kinds of selves, right? So with me, I have one self that is the professional who works with clients. I have another self who is, the funny jokester who likes to hang out with his friends. I'm the father who likes to play with his young children. You have a lot of different roles in your life and a lot of different kinds of personalities that you'll project in different situations. And so be yourself sort of kicks the can down the road and forces you to ask, okay, like what exactly is the self that I want to project? Because no person is just one thing all the time. Next. And lastly, is the, show, don't tell, right? Don't tell me, show me. This is a piece of advice that if, a lot of you have taken freshman English, like your professors will go over this and really insist. And again, this, if you understand what this is trying to tell you, which is to not give lists and just say, oh, I'm a great candidate, but instead to show the reader why, then yes, it makes sense and can be a good piece of advice. But most people don't really quite grasp what it is that don't tell me, show me means. Next. All right, and here's the 3 most common mistakes that people in their personal statements will make. First, restating your CV, right? I see it all the time. Basically, if you look at a personal statement or any piece of admissions writing, it will just look like a person's life. Like, I went to college, first job, second job, third job, and then a little paragraph at the end that talks about what they want to do. And I want to join these 6 clubs, and I've talked to this one person who's an alumni. Therefore, please let me into Wharton, right? Don't just restate your CV. Right? That's not interesting. There's a reason why you will submit a CV and a personal statement, usually with your application, because they're meant to do different things. Second, if your essays don't have any tension or passion, right? If you don't convey that this is something that you're really excited about and invested in and really looking forward to and are going to commit yourself to fully, then the reader will sense that, right? And it will feel like you're just trying to check a box in your career progression, and it's not compelling to them. And the final, the final one, which I'll talk about in some detail later, is your essay. If it's not forward-looking, right, it focuses only on what you're doing now or you've done in the past, then that's a big mistake. At the end of the day, your application needs to be about who you are going to be, what you are going to do, and projecting forward based on what you have done to date. All right, so it has to be forward-looking. Next. All right, so there's good news here and bad news here. Next. Right? Effective storytelling will solve all of these problems. If you tell stories well, you will convey a brand. You will not repeat your CV. Like all of those things that I just talked about, good stories fix that. Next. The bad news is most people don't know how to tell a story. And that's sort of where this comes in, and this talk and the things that I do. Next. All right, so I want to take a second to just reinforce to you why storytelling is so effective. And I'll take a bit of a tangent here to talk about what the neuroscience tells us about storytelling and why this should ultimately be the focus of what you do in your application writings. Next. All right, so this sounds a little abstract, but our identities are constructed on the stories that we tell about ourselves. We remember stories about other people even before we remember their CVs. I'm one of those people who I'm really bad about remembering names. This is a thing I struggle with, but I will always remember 5 or 6 things that you told me if they're in story form. I could have met you a decade ago, and I will meet you and say, "Oh, you're the guy who's been to every World Cup since 1970, right?" But I don't remember your name. I'm sorry. Next. So once you understand and appreciate that storytelling is kind of central to the approach that you want to take, it's important to also think about how our brains think about stories. Now, one of the really cool things, if you go down this sort of nerd rabbit hole, is that if you read about people who are like these memory champions, these people who will remember 85,000 digits of pi and things like that, what they're doing is they're actually creating stories. And so they'll tell about numbers will turn into objects in their mind. So a 3 will represent like a hippopotamus, and a 4 will represent a house. And as they go through, they're constructing stories. And the reason for that is that our brains are really bad at semantic memories. And what does this mean? It's numbers, dates, names, facts, right? We remember about 13% of that. So very poor retention. What we care about are episodic memories. What you did, what happened, and places. Those are the things that our brain remembers at a really high rate. And we care about those. Our brains are wired to care about those things, about change moments, pivot points, crises, triumphs, emotions. Our brains are set up to remember those things in the same way that our brains are sort of set up to remember faces and not hands. And so if I were to show you a picture of your brother's face, you would instantly recognize it. But if I were to show you a picture of your brother's hand, you might not, right? Our brains really crave and care about stories. And so when an admissions reader, an admissions officer reads your story and it's compelling and interesting, it will have an impact on them that's much more effective than listing off like the numbers and dates and facts of what your professional accomplishments were. Next. And like I said before, like I've worked with thousands of clients and I don't remember many CVs, right? So I don't remember necessarily where you went to school or that you won XYZ award, but I will remember stories. Right? I'll remember the accomplishment that you did. I'll remember this sense of difficulty that you faced and encountered. And if you want to be memorable and you want to make an impact, then think about your application in terms of the story that it tells about you. Next. All right. So hopefully I've convinced you that stories are important. And so now you have to figure out how that you can actually build a compelling story. First point, focus on action. What did you do? You have to be the main character in your story, right? Don't just describe kind of things that were happening around you. Focus at all points about like, okay, what was I doing either in response to something or to create some action? It includes emotional content. I'm not talking here about like an over the top tear jerker, where you're trying to make the reader cry by the end. But instead, I'm talking about making sure that the reader understands that at certain points where things were difficult, you felt a sense of tension and difficulty. And when things worked well, you were excited about it, and that you were excited about the future and you're excited about the things that you're going to attempt to do in the future. Third point is congruity. It all hangs together. And what I mean by that is all points of the story, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second, they should seem like they're telling the same story about the same person. And it shouldn't be discrete achievements that seem disconnected from each other. All right. Again, I'll talk about this more in a second. And finally, you should include a villain. And what I mean by this is not some actual person who you're fighting against, right? Don't focus on some coworker that you hated or something like that, but rather recognize that your story will only be compelling if you make it clear the difficulty that you encountered, right? And have this what I call a point of potential failure. Like the reader needs to understand how and why it is that the thing that you accomplished was so important, right? That the prospect of maybe it was so hard that you might not have been able to do it, but you did, right? The bigger the villain, the more impressive it is that you were able to overcome it, right? So, again, think of it in terms of any movie, right? So if Darth Vader in Star Wars was just some puny wimp, then it's no big deal that Luke Skywalker was able to defeat him, right? But if the villain is big, the accomplishment is big as well. Next. All right. So here are kind of 5 tips that you can use in order to put these ideas into concrete action so that you can understand how to pick and write compelling stories that achieve the goal of engaging the reader and making them understand that the thing that you have done is an impressive achievement. Next. All right. So point 1 is to begin with a point of tension. And I mean begin in 2 ways, right? First, I mean it in terms of planning. And by that, I mean, like when you think about your achievement, one of the exercises that I'll do when I actually, sit down, well, no one sits down with anyone anymore because of COVID. So when I Zoom with someone, a client, and they'll talk about a difficult moment or a big achievement, and I'll actually try to get them to give me like an exact date, an exact time. I'm like, okay, I want to parachute, pretend to have a time machine and you need to put in, the day, date, and time of day when things were the most difficult, right? I want to understand exactly that precise moment where the things were hardest, because at that moment I can begin to understand why this was a big accomplishment, all the things that you were trying to do, all of the things you were feeling at that moment, and therefore get a sense of why it was such a big deal that you actually accomplished it. Next. So, secondly, though, when I say begin with a point of tension, a lot of times it actually makes sense to start your essay with the most difficult or challenging moment. So I say here, don't be married to chronology. Overwhelmingly, when I get like a first draft of a business school essay, there's a format that people just use, and there's nothing, doesn't make you a bad person if you use it, but it starts with, this point in childhood where I first was exposed to, let's say, computers, right? And there's a charming story about how, your uncle taught you how to program. You then went to, university of whatever, got your degree in computer programming. You then at your first job did this. You then at your second job did that. You're now doing this. You want to go to business school X. These are the reasons why. And that set model will convey a lot of the important information, but it's not very interesting. And so what I'll say is that you can play with chronology a little bit. You can actually start your essay at the point where things are most tense, and you can explain it from there, and then you can maybe take a step back and reset the chronology later in the essay. So you don't have to have this start at the beginning of my life and end today. Chronological model. Second point here is introduce the prospect of failure. This is one of the things a lot of times clients will struggle with the most. Like they want to project this idea that there are these amazing, invincible candidates who, no matter how complicated the task that they encounter, they just crush it, right? They feel like they want the admissions officer to say, oh, look at Johnny, he's amazing. Like he's climbed Mount Everest 9 times. He has 2 PhDs, you know, he became the youngest partner at his firm, whatever. For the most part, that's not an interesting that's not an interesting approach, because if in your career you have not been challenged, or you convey the idea that in your career you have not been challenged, at least subconsciously in the reader, what they're getting from that is that you haven't actually taken big steps or big chances, that you've kind of just floated along and done things, and that's fine. But there's no sense of dynamism or potential there, which is related to this third point, right? Like, think like a movie. The audience won't care if they don't think the hero might lose. All right. Again, this is just kind of a central aspect of storytelling, that if you want to create tension, make the thing, whatever assignment it was in your career, or whatever career move, or if you started a business, then really focus on all the ways that it might not have gone well. All right. And think about that so that you can, in a way that's honest, of course, but like blow up, that is expand and make big and compelling and scary. All of the ideas related to, like, oh my goodness, this was a really, really fantastic and cool thing that Sarah did, even though it really seemed like the odds were stacked against her, she was able to pull it off. Like, that's the sense that you want the reader to come away from it with. And then next point is what I talked about a second ago. In your most important accomplishment, what was the most difficult and challenging moment? Like, think about the time machine exercise, where you've got to transport me back to a precise moment, right? Don't talk broadly speaking about, here's this task that I had to do. Like, I was in charge of an acquisition of a company, and you talk about it vaguely. Like, no, talk about the meeting with the CEO that gave you the impossible challenge, etc. And then finally, spend a bit of space describing the moment. Again, most of these essays have pretty tight space constraints. And so, you know, if it's 500 words, or was MIT's like 350 or something like that, you obviously, you know, you can't be Baudelaire and write 5 paragraphs about the wallpaper, but you can take a sentence or two to describe exactly what was going on in the room, how you were feeling, what you were thinking at that moment, why it was impressive, or why it was a very, like, emotionally charged or difficult thing that you were taking on. You can take really strategic and thoughtful moments to actually describe what it is that you were going through and thinking, and sort of describe the setting. Next. All right. So here's what I want to give you a couple of examples taken from real personal statements that former clients have been kind enough to let me use, with kind of the main, the dates and names and et cetera have been changed to protect the innocent, et cetera. Next. All right. So a client comes to me, and this is kind of the first iteration in one of their paragraphs, right? So say, in 2018, my team in Initech work on a $17,500,000 go-to-market strategy for Digitrobe. It was difficult working through the compliance and regulatory issues given the tight one-day time frame. Despite the deadline, we completed the job on time and brought in a $6 million contract for Initech. Okay, fine. All right. It is okay. Next. Next. I talked to them. And they came back after our consult, and we worked through some aspects of the story. And this is what they had, right? As I hung up the phone, my heart sank and my skin ran cold. The night before our final pitch to the board, the client called demanding an entirely new go-to-market strategy. We had 14 hours to complete a job that needed at least 2 weeks. My mentor, ever the optimist, chuckled, well, you don't take a job like this at a company like this unless you're prepared to do the impossible. That was all I needed to hear. Looking over the vast expanse of skyscrapers towering over Tokyo, I chugged another sip of Red Bull and got back to work. Next. All right. So why does this story work so much better than the first? All right. It focuses on tension. I feel it more clearly that this might not work, right? The client called at the last minute on a pretty big deal, had massive changes that they wanted to make. They had 14 hours. Oh my goodness, this, you can't do it, right? Obviously, what happens next in the essays, they talked about how they worked together as a team and were able to figure it out, pulled it together, the client was happy. But what this essay does is it starts with this immediate sense of tension, right? And if you show difficulty, what this conveys to the reader is this is a person who can handle demanding situations. They take things in stride, all of those things. And it also hits kind of some of the things we talked about in the neuroscience section about physical manifestations are things that we care about. So like just taking a second to say, your heart sank, right? Or locating it in a place, just a brief mention of Tokyo. You don't have to go on and on and on about how, the lights of Shibuya were glimmering and all that. You can just mention it, but it anchors it there. All right. So it's a much more interesting and compelling story that makes the protagonist, that is the writer, that is the applicant, come across in a much more effective and powerful way. Next. All right. Second tip, make sure that your story is congruent. All right. So what do I mean by this? Next. All right. So again and again, the thing that if there's probably, other than tell a good story or focus on storytelling, the thing that I want you to really take away from this is that you should think about your application essays as being about the future. Okay. A personal statement or any of the sort of writing assignments that are associated with an MBA application is a way of talking about your future by using stories from your past. Again, this is not like a CV where you sort of just list discrete accomplishments. And if it feels like a CV, you've done it wrong. The first exercise that I do when I'm working with clients is to basically ask them to fill out these 3 boxes, where what I want to do is to get them to think about their trajectory in a straight line. So they say, okay, who was I / what did I do? Right, that's the past. Who am I now and what am I doing? That's the present. Who will I be and what will I be doing? Right, that's the future. And if all of those things kind of make sense as 3 points in a straight line, they're all connected, then it's much more likely that your essay will be effective than ineffective. Next. All right, so here are 2 approaches, one of which I think is a good approach and one of which I think is a bad approach with respect to congruency. All right, so first candidate, right? In their essay, they kind of build it around 3 different things. First, biggest accomplishment was handling due diligence and compliance on a $5 million merger. Second, currently working with PepsiCo on diversity initiatives. Third, wants to create a company that provides artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data solutions to medium-sized retailers. All right, that's candidate 1. Next. Candidate 2. Biggest accomplishment was getting the company to adopt machine learning for inventory management. They're currently introducing artificial intelligence to all aspects of Wendy's supply chain. And third, wants to create a company that provides AI, machine learning, big data solutions to medium-sized retailers. Next. All right, so the problem with the first applicant is when you look at kind of point by point, the different accomplishments, they're each individually fairly impressive, right? So it's not like this essay would have been a disaster, but it doesn't really feel like it's one person. And it's really hard to figure out the kind of the central thread that goes through it, where by the time the reader is really kind of digging into, okay, why does candidate number 1 want to create a company that provides AI, machine learning, and big data solutions? Nothing about your present or past suggests that this is something that you're qualified to do, prepared to do, have an understanding of, have relationships within that field, et cetera, right? That's a problem because this is kind of an incongruous or incoherent approach to their application essay. Next. The second candidate, though, right, like this makes sense. Their past says, okay, I did this in the past where they got the company to adopt machine learning for inventory management. So that's what they did in the past. Right now, they're currently introducing artificial intelligence to all aspects of Wendy's supply chain, right? Right now, they're still doing that same thing. Excuse me. And then finally, they want to create a company that provides AI, machine learning, and big data solutions to medium-sized retailers. That's the future. The 3 points on that line connect. That makes sense. I understand that candidate. And more to the point, when I'm thinking about, okay, candidate number two wants to do this thing, right? And I'm a business school admissions officer and say, okay, can they actually do it? That's one of the questions that at least subconsciously is going through their minds. Like, is this a silly pipe dream? Are they just, read something in The Economist about how AI and big data are a big deal, and so therefore they want to jump in this field? The first candidate feels a little bit like that, but the second candidate, I understand how and why they've gotten to this point. All right, and that's much more clear and much more compelling. Next. All right. So again, both candidates have compelling stories, but one doesn't quite make sense. All right, and that will be felt by the reader. And so, the thing that a lot of times I'll talk to clients about is not trying to shoehorn. That is, they don't try to force in accomplishments, even if they don't quite fit the story. There is sometimes there work that you can do to like make all the things that you want fit in, but you really shouldn't try to force it too much because phone went off. Because you don't want it just to feel like it was something that you just pulled out of the blue in order to just let the reader know, oh, by the way, I also founded this club in college where we did this other thing, right? It should feel natural, and it should feel within the structure of the theme that you're trying to create about who you are. Next. All right. And this is, again, like I said before, other than really focusing on stories, this is the one thing that I really want you to take away from this. An admissions essay is a statement about your future, not your past. And I know this seems counterintuitive because, what are you going to write about? You're going to write about, at least partly or mostly, about the things that you are doing and the things that you have done. Next. All right. So an admissions essay, like I said, is about projecting who you are and evaluating the dream and the plan that you're selling. Okay. When I'm an admissions officer and I sit down and I'm trying to gauge how strong your application is, I am saying, okay, you are saying that you're going to do these things. I'm going to evaluate the dream that you have or the plan that you have kind of independently. Like, is it an interesting idea in and of itself? And then secondary to that is, or very much connected to, it's not really secondary, connected to that is, are you the person who can actually make this thing happen? All right. So as you plan your essay, and also, and this is true of like your big picture admission strategy, start by making clear to yourself what your future is. That will inform the things from your current life, or your current career, that you choose to pull out and put in your essay. And it'll also inform the things from your past that you want to pull in. And so the metaphor that I use here is that, like, this is a bit like buying stocks or any type of investment. What you're selling is the future. That's what the admissions officer is basically looking at, right? Like, is this a stock that's going to go on the rise? And the past is relevant, yes, but only because past performance is a good indicator of future potential, right? So everything that you put in there about your past needs to be toward the end of selling who you are going to become. And so that should inform the things that you decide to include, the moments from your life that you choose to focus on. It all needs to be directed towards supporting your vision of who you are going to become, and therefore, what you can do with your MBA and your business career. Next. All right. Tip 4 is focus on the hero's two journeys. Now, again, if any of you are kind of movie fans, you'll know that this idea of the hero's two journeys is an idea that was created by someone named Joseph Campbell. But the core idea is that in the West, every compelling story focuses on like these two tracks. Next. The first is like what you actually did. Okay. That is, so for you, it would be like, did you close a deal? Did you turn around a company? Did you build a clothing brand? Did you make a name for yourself in advertising? Whatever it is, right? It's the actual discrete accomplishment. The second one that should run parallel to that is, how did the journey to that accomplishment change you? All right. So along the way, did it teach you to be tough? Did it teach you how to become a leader? Did it allow you to prove to yourself that you belonged at the grown-ups table, right? Whatever it is, your essay needs to have both, right? And again, and if any of you are not movie fans, I apologize for this slight diversion, but if you think about all the movies or the stories that you like, they all have this element, and it really does run the gamut of everything from like a romantic comedy like Pride and Prejudice, for example. Like, what's happening there? It's about a woman who just the dry beats of it are she meets someone, she falls in love, doesn't quite work out, but then it does, and they get married. But what's really happening is the two main characters both go on a journey where they change, right? The protagonist is a different woman at the start than she is at the end. And Mr. Darcy, the man, right, he becomes a different person. Star Wars, the same thing. Yes, it's about Luke Skywalker growing and progressing to a point where he can strike down the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. Sorry, spoiler alert. But at the heart of that story is about someone who undergoes a personal transformation. Same thing if you watch the Avengers, right? Who was Tony Stark at the start of those series of movies, and then who was he at the end? He's a changed person. So what does that have to do with an admissions essay? Your essay, if it's done well, will convey both of these things: the discrete thing that you did and how you changed along the way. So if I read your essay, I should understand, okay, when you first got to Digitech, you knew computers, but you weren't really great at network building or interpersonal communications. You didn't have leadership skills. This series of things that you had to take on forced you to grow in these ways, and you began to realize talents that you didn't have, and that allowed you to close the big deal, right? So two things are happening there. Yes, you closed the big deal, which is the discrete accomplishment, but second to that, there is this personal growth that you've gone on, all right? And that's also really incredibly important to make sure that you have in your essay. Next. All right, tip 5 is to make sure that you infuse emotional content. Next. And again, the idea here isn't like to be crazy over the top or, have these scenes where you're tearing your clothes and weeping and all that, right? You'll come across as a crazy person if you do that, but rather to think about how it is that you can convey passion, that you're excited about something, that you care about things, right? And so how do you do that? The first bit of advice is fewer stories told well, right? If you have 500 words and you're trying to cram in 5 stories, that's not enough, right? It's just not enough space. You're better off figuring out, say, 2 stories or maybe 3 that you tell well, where you take the reader through what the conflict was, what you accomplished, who you were at the start, who you were at the beginning. That's much better than trying to basically turn your essay into a list of things that you've done. Second point, focus on actions connected to decisions. Every moment in the essay where you make a decision, it should feel a bit like a crossroads, right? Like you could do this or you could do that, right? Your background is in computer programming, but you knew that, like, if you wanted the career that you wanted, you needed to become a better leader and a more outspoken person. So you took action in some way, right, to do that. You either took a new type of job or you took classes in public speaking, whatever it was, right? You are taking action so that the reader feels like you're the one who's driving your story. Remember the things that resonate with people. Again, this is going back to what we were talking about before: choices, actions, feelings, tension, place. Try to find ways to put those into your essay so that it's interesting to read and it connects to them on a gut level. And again, go easy on things that won't resonate. Tons of numbers, tons of amounts and dates. A lot of times I'll also get, you'll have essays that are maybe too hyper technical, right? And if you have to understand the inner workings of your company in a really granular and complicated way, and you then have to explain that in the essay, then maybe take a step back and figure out a way that you can clean that up so that it's a little bit more straightforward and clear to a reader who doesn't know how, like Samsung's research and development arm works. And so, be careful about the details that you put in and put out, because well-chosen details will engage the reader and make them feel interested in you rather. But poorly chosen one will just bog down your essays. Like, why do I have to know that this person reports to that person who then has to sign a TPS form to do whatever? Clean all of that up. It should be much more direct and clear exactly what's happening, and kind of focus on the basics. Next. Now, most business school prompts will ask you to write some version of the following, right? So what is your biggest accomplishment? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? What are your short, medium, and long-term goals? Tell me about a time that you failed. What is your most important value? There's some kind of zany ones, like Duke has, let's list 25 things about yourself. And different schools will have kind of different curveball questions. But for the most part, the the idea of storytelling and building a coherent and powerful and interesting story will work with any of these kinds of stories, right? The one thing that I would just kind of highlight is that, this tell me about a time that you failed. The thing there is like, yeah, you do want to, if you're asked this, you do want to have an actual failure, right? And not one of these like phony ones that politicians give. Like, there was a time I was too dynamic and too charismatic and too smart. Have a real failure, but the focus of the essay should be on how you recovered from it, how you learned from it, and if possible, how when you encountered the same thing again, you did better and didn't demonstrate that failing. Okay. Next. Next. All right. So, like I said, storytelling is hard. If you follow these steps, and again, I would encourage you to go to blog.gurufi.com and just download the worksheet, and it'll sort of take you through these things. It will make it easier to build an essay that meets all these that checks all the boxes for good storytelling. And if you feel like your application needs to be supercharged by the power of stories, and you want support for every step along the way in doing this, Gurufi is here to help. So, yeah, feel free to come to our site, and we'll help tell your story. You'll learn strategies for putting together an outstanding and powerful application essay, and you'll get your personal statement writing done in a way that's really effective and powerful. One last note, next. Is that we're doing a business school boot camp for MBA folks. Not this weekend, but the next. We used to do this live in New York City. It was a ton of fun, believe it or not. Writing personal statements can be a little bit fun, but it's not this weekend, but next, October 31st, November 1st. 2 all-day sessions. At the end of it, end of the process, you'll have a personal statement that's good to go. You'll get boot camp prep materials that's designed to get you started kind of beforehand. There's this 2-day intensive workshop. And then afterwards, you'll have a one-on-one consultation, and then someone to help you with the actual revision and refining process at the end. Next. And price, $14.95, but if you use the GMAT Club discount code, which is GMAT Club, shocker, you'll save $500 on it. And if you get a friend to sign up, it's $100. And again, you can learn more about that at blog.gurufi.com. So again, if there's one big takeaway that I want you to have, it's to think about this to think about your essays in terms of stories. And I know that it can be a really challenging and difficult and very nervous undertaking to write these personal statements. But if you try to break it down in these discrete steps, I think that what you'll find is that the story that you want to tell sort of emerges from that. So thank you all. I went slightly longer than I wanted to, but hopefully this was a really useful presentation for getting you guys to the place that you want to be with your personal statements. So if there are questions, I'll go ahead and take a few minutes to answer those. I see that there's a question from Divya. A question for how to introduce career gap to minimize the impact on overall application. So that's a hard question to answer in the abstract. And here's what I mean by that. It sort of depends on why you took a break, right? So, for example, I get clients that all sorts of things. So there are things that kind of fall into one bucket, which is like I have a lot of clients who come from Korea and they have mandatory military service, right? That doesn't need a ton of explanation. It's like, hey, I had to go serve in the Korean Army for 2 years, right? That's all you need. That's basically all the explanation that you need. Things like an illness, sort of falls into that same bucket. Unemployment can be a little bit more challenging. If there are bad things that happen to you, you fired, lost your job, then the questions that I would want to ask is, okay, what did you do during that time? What did you learn from it? Kind of what happened after the gap. There are lots of questions that you can do to, think about it this way, right? It's like it's a weird metaphor, but it's a little bit like when men start losing their hair, right? And you'll see some people will try to fight it with a comb over or a wig or whatever. I always thought the smartest approach was just shave your head, right? If you can't fix it, feature it. And so there is this if you have like a challenging spot in your CV or a gap, then what you should do is to think about, okay, how can I figure out ways to tell a story that is truthful, obviously, but that makes clear that that time away from my last professional trajectory was a really useful one for me. And I figured out ways to come out of that a better professional. I learned these lessons, right? And I'm a better person because of it. Obviously, if you just write like, "Oh, I got fired and I spent the next 18 months playing Xbox and eating Cheetos," that's a terrible approach, and it's not a thoughtful one. And so, it's sort of like anytime you're going to sit for any kind of interview, you need to know what are the things that people are going to ask, and a gap in your CV is something that people will ask. And so, have a story for it. Like, and it really will depend on your personal trajectory. What did you do before it? Why did it happen? Afterwards, who were you as a person and as a professional? Like that will help you to fill that in if it's something again that does need to be filled in. How to deal with questions which ask about your 18-year-old self. I think kind of what you're asking is that maybe when you were in college, or your freshman year, you didn't get good grades or something like that. Is that kind of what you're asking? Well, I'll pretend that is what you're asking if it's not. So here's the way to think about it. There is kind of the technical functional approach, which is that admissions committees know that it's often the case that people arrive at their undergraduate institutions maybe not as fully mature and developed as they need to be. And in fact, there are some schools that will either weight your GPA either internally and sometimes even externally, so that like your freshman year grades are like 0.5x, and your senior year grades, your fourth year undergraduate grades, are like 1.5x. For a time, there were a couple of schools that actually didn't even ask you about your freshman year of undergraduate grades. That said, it's also the case that what you do is you go through a process. Like this is true of any really bad part of your application. So if there's any part of your application that is going to be asked about and is a problem, right? Confront it, like explain without euphemism, right? Just be naked about it, right? So like when I was a freshman, I did not show up psychologically prepared for the rigors of college. I got a 1.6 my freshman year, got put on academic probation. I realized that if I wanted to meet my professional goals, this wasn't good enough. And so the next 3 years I did whatever, right? I improved. And then my subsequent career has shown that I can handle these things. And if you've gone back and done additional coursework, and so what you have to do is just confront it, explain why it happened, and then provide some demonstration or explanation for how it is and why it is that your subsequent experiences demonstrate that this was just a blip. And, and I can tell you that I have had a lot of clients who come in assuming that a bad freshman and sophomore year grades will sort of tank their application chances, and they won't. Like obviously, yeah, you would love to have a 4.0 GPA every single semester, but that's often not the case. And people are late bloomers sometimes. And so if it went from 1.6 to 4.0, that's a story that you can tell and that you can sell. But you do have to be honest about it and explain why it happened. Explain how you've changed, like the discrete changes you've made in terms of your approach to professionalism or to studying or whatever, and then provide subsequent examples that show that you are no longer this person who didn't take things seriously, that you're smart, driven, committed, professional, reliable, etc. How to overcome imposter syndrome. Whenever I sit down to write, I just feel I lack a lot of skills. Yeah, so I'd say two things. One, it may make you happy to know that most research on imposter syndrome suggests that it's much more common in smart people. So if you're feeling imposter syndrome, it's less likely that you're dumb. So that's the first good thing. Second is, yeah, this is a real thing. So I went to Yale, as you can see, my little sign. And I was one of those people who didn't think I would get in, and I just applied because the thing I told myself was, well, what's the worst that can happen, right? I lose $75, I can afford that, and I felt like it was a Hail Mary. And part of imposter syndrome comes from building up people at an institution way beyond who they are. And so you think that you're going to arrive at like an Ivy League or a top school, Stanford, whatever, and every single person is going to be, this genetic hybrid between Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Albert Einstein. And it's just not true. Yeah, people there are smart. You'll meet doofuses there too, but like, you really do have to just come from the point of self-belief of like, yeah, I do belong here. I put the asterisk on that as like, if you don't, some people don't belong there. If you have a 1.2 GPA and you've not had a job in 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. But, if you give yourself an honest assessment and you feel like you fall within the range, generally speaking, of a school, don't talk yourself out of it. Imposter syndrome is real, and the best people feel it at different points, right? Like, whatever school you think is a dream school, let me tell you something about it. There are professors at that school who feel imposter syndrome, who feel like every day, like, I don't belong here, right? And whatever they project, I know this is true because I have friends who are professors, is absolutely the case. And so, yeah, like, I don't know you, Amani, but you do find a way to believe. And part of that is like, tell your best story, right? And the last little thing I'll say here is that this is like a strange piece of advice given what I do, and also the fact that I'm talking to people who are applying to a school. The other thing here that's really important is that don't invest in admissions committees like this kind of like godlike status. And so the number of, like, yes, do try your absolute best to do everything you can to get into a school. But when I hear people talk about admissions committees, it's almost like they feel like they have like the philosopher's stone that allows them to peer into your soul and measure your worth as a human being. That's not it. Like, they're people who have, 8 or 10 pages of material on you, and they're trying to figure out the kind of class they want to put together. And so, yeah, try your best to get into a school, but if it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean you're a terrible person, right? You can tell yourself, well, okay, they made a mistake. I'll go forward and do great things and find ways to prove them wrong. And that's fine. Like, it's, having been in those rooms, I know, like, you do your best to figure out who you think is the best candidate, but you don't know those people, right? And so that's why it's also incumbent on you, by the way, to make sure that the best stuff is in your essay. So yeah, but yeah, it's a real thing, and the only way to get through is to power through it. Can I touch upon any personal tragedy which changed my life's perspective? Yeah. A couple of caveats with that are that you do want to be thoughtful about making sure that it is actually connected to the thing you want to do, right? So, if, for example, you want to talk about how, so let's say you came from an abusive background, you were homeless for a while, whatever it is, the personal tragedy. But then the thing you say at the end is like, okay, I want to do artificial intelligence and big data. All right. Well, it doesn't like quite track unless you do the work in the middle to show like how from personal tragedy to like this particular field, you get there. You can do it. The other thing that I would say is that you do want to make sure that you still find ways to have kind of an overall positive tone, if that's possible. And also understand that sometimes readers will just get uncomfortable with certain types of personal tragedies if you go in kind of like too much detail. And so, if you have a 500-word essay and the first 150 pages are about 500-word essay and your first 150 words are about your difficult family dynamic, that might be too much, right? Like, you don't want to spend a third of your essay focusing on that. But yeah, you can do that, especially if it explains like these pivotal moments, right? So a great example would be like if, there was someone I worked with last year who was, they had a public health degree in there, and they basically wanted to get an MBA because they wanted to found a particular type of medical company that would treat a kind of cancer that afflicted his father. And so like that makes sense, right? You have this thing that happened in your family, you have a very clear professional aspiration that addresses it. Or I've worked with people from the Middle East who come from difficult backgrounds, and the thing that they were focused on is finding ways to diversify the Middle Eastern economy, because they've seen, for instance, um, you know in Lebanon has a power grid that has some problems. And so like their difficult situation growing up, where like they often didn't have electricity, hospitals would run out of power. So this is a problem I want to address. And so yeah, personal tragedy can be the impetus for a story, but you just want to be really thoughtful about how you go about creating it. Let me see here. Does a bad essay really hurt an incredible GMAT score? Yeah. I mean, yes. Um, Look, to build on what I just said, there is no like absolute perfect formula for getting into any like business school. Like there are things you can generally do to improve your chances. So I will tell you that there are people who've gotten into very good schools with bad essays, right? Or essays that could be much better, right? Because other things in their package were good. And that's just, your score is good, great recommendations, CV really tracks, you're super dynamite, right? You can overcome it. But uh, it's better if it's not, right? So yeah, Usain Bolt could still beat me in a race if he had a backpack full of sand on him, but he's not going to win a gold medal. So yeah, you can overcome it. But you're obviously much better off if you have a good essay. So I wouldn't plan, I wouldn't have your strategy be, let me just kill the GMAT and then have a B- essay and then I'll get into Wharton. It's a bit of a Hail Mary. Is buying essays legal? No, it is not. It is illegal. And so, um, most companies that are reputable, and I would include mine in that, they have ethical guidelines. So we don't write your essay. We won't. You can back the Brinks truck up to our office and we won't do it. We work with you to build an essay, right? Help you, like, walk you through the outlining process, help you with revisions, go back and forth, all of that. But if you find a site online that will sell you an essay for $1,500 or whatever it is, if you get caught, you can get in trouble. So, there was just last year a huge scandal in the United States involving a bunch of famous people who are now in jail because it's fraud. And so, yeah, don't go online and buy an essay. Bad news. Do I have time for one more question? Using quotes at the start of an essay, how does it sound? All right, so again, I don't think it's going to kill your essay. What my point of view is that your essays should be your story, um, and so it's best if it's in your words and from your perspective. And so I wouldn't do it. The other thing is that when you're in the business of like reading a lot of essays, the thing that you'll discover pretty quickly is that people tend to use the same quotes, right? And so, oh, look, another candidate who quoted from Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement speech. Oh, shocker, right? Or, be the change you want to see in the world by Gandhi. Like, if I had a nickel for every time I saw either of those quotes at the start of an essay, I could retire. And so, but you don't necessarily know that from your end, right? And so what I would say is, like, focus on the personal part of personal statement. Make this your story. And so if there's an idea that a quote conveys, like, figure out how you can convey that through smart storytelling in a way that is really powerful and effective. All right. Thank you. If you guys have, hopefully you found this useful. If you have questions, shoot me an email, service@gurufi.com. I'll be happy to answer them. And also check out our blog, blog.gurufi.com, or check out our site. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.